On March 25, 1971, at Frunze Central Airfield, right in the middle of Moscow, a heavy four-engine aircraft was being prepared for its first flight. Specialists doubted whether the runway, confined within city limits, would be long enough. Kodinka Field wasn't some experimental airstrip out on the steppe, where a mistake could be fixed with another 2 kilometers of concrete. It was an urban airfield, with people living all around it. A machine weighing over 100 tons was meant to lift off before the runway ran out. They decided to take the risk. The commander was honored test pilot, hero of the Soviet Union, Eduard Kuznetsov. The aircraft climbed, headed east, and landed just outside the city, at Ramenskoye Airfield. The runway was enough. That turned out to matter more than it seemed that day, because the entire rest of this machine's career would be built around one single quality: landing where an aircraft of this size supposedly has no business landing. This is the Il-76, the first jet-powered military transport aircraft in the history of the Soviet Union. Up until the mid-60s, the country's primary transport aircraft was the An-12, a turboprop, reliable and undemanding. The problem wasn't its quality, the problem was arithmetic. It managed well enough, it could carry 2 infantry fighting vehicles, or 60 paratroopers, and it essentially put the Soviet airborne forces on their feet. But both the troops and their equipment kept growing, and so did the demands on how fast they needed to be moved. The task for the new aircraft was stated plainly by comparison with its predecessor: payload and range twice that of the An-12, and without any degradation in takeoff and landing performance. That last part was the trap. A turboprop aircraft runs into a ceiling of its own. Propellers work well at low speeds, but past a certain threshold, they simply can't push the aircraft any faster. And anything that flies faster usually needs a better runway to do it. On June 28, 1966, the Ministry of the Aviation Industry commissioned the Ilyushin Design Bureau to develop a new military transport aircraft. The technical requirements were harsh to the point of contradiction. Cruising speed, no less than 750 kilometers per hour. That meant jet engines. There was no other option. And alongside that, the ability to operate from dirt runways 1.5 to 2,000 meters long. That exact combination was the whole difficulty. A jet aircraft flies fast, but it's heavy and demanding when it comes to surfaces. It needs a long, level, sturdy runway. Dirt, snow, broken concrete, that's the territory of slower, turboprop-powered aircraft. They had to build an aircraft that could do both. On February 25, 1967, Sergei Vladimirovich Ilyushin approved the technical proposal. On November 27th of that same year, a Council of Ministers decree was issued. The work was led by Ilyushin Vasilyevich Novozhilov, at the time, Deputy General Designer. On July 28, 70, with work on the machine already in full swing, he would take over the bureau entirely, succeeding Ilyushin himself in that role. The preliminary design work was led by Leshchina. The contradiction in the requirements was resolved through the power plant. The aircraft received 4 D-30 kp turbofan engines, designed by Pavel Solovyov's bureau. On the first production aircraft, they produced 11,000 kilograms of thrust each. Later, 12,000. But what mattered wasn't the raw number, it was the range. These engines let the aircraft hold steady across a speed band from 260 to 850 kilometers per hour. 850 is cruise. 260 is for airdrops, when the aircraft has to fly as slowly as possible so that troops and equipment can exit the cargo hold safely. One machine, 2 completely different operating modes. The second half of the task was the landing gear. To land on dirt, you have to avoid pressing down on it too hard. The aircraft got 5 landing gear legs and 20 wheels. 20, so that 100+ tons would spread across the surface instead of gouging into the runway at just 4 points. And tire pressure adjusts to the surface, pumped up harder for concrete, let down to nearly 2/3 for dirt. The tail section carries a cargo ramp that lowers to the ground and lets vehicles drive into the aircraft under their own power. The cargo cabin was designed for one specific mission: to accept the entire range of airborne forces equipment. From the inside, it isn't an aircraft in the usual sense. It's a hangar with wings. A long, rectangular bay with folding seats for paratroopers running along the sides, hoists tracking along the ceiling for moving cargo, and a clear lane down the middle for armoured vehicles to drive straight into the machine. A paratrooper sitting there before a drop hears the steady drone of 4 engines and feels the aircraft slow down before the ramp opens. Then the tail opens up and air and light pour into the compartment. The nose section is split into 2 cabins. Up top sit the pilots, and directly below them, in a glazed chin pod, sits the navigator. A solution inherited from bomber design, giving an excellent view of the ground during airdrops. On military versions, there's a 3rd cabin too, at the tail with a gunner's station, a transport aircraft with a gunner sitting at the back. On May 5, 1973, the crew of test pilot Alexander Churyumin lifted the first production aircraft into the air. The Il-76 was assembled in Tashkent at the Chkalov aircraft plant. On December 15, 1974, state testing concluded. On April 21, 1976, the aircraft was officially accepted into service. And between those 2 dates, the machine showed what it was capable of. In July of 1975, the crew of honoured test pilot, hero of the Soviet Union, Yakov Ilyich Vernikov, lifted a payload of more than 70 tons to an altitude of almost 12,000 meters. That same day, Churyumin's crew flew a closed circuit at an average speed of just under 860 kilometers per hour, carrying that same 70 tons on board. In a single day, 4 world payload records. What followed was a career that has now lasted 55 years. The Il-76 carried troops and equipment. Over 10 years of the Afghan War, aircraft of this type flew more than 14,500 sorties. They carried the core of the entire supply effort. In '86, an Il-76 TD, given its own name, Antarctica, began flying to the 7th continent. And in July of '89, the crew of Stanislav Bliznyuk landed a heavy transport aircraft on Antarctic ice for the first time in history, in the depths of the polar winter. A civilian version appeared, the Il-76T, a transport version with no armament. The Il-76M appeared too, with a reinforced fuselage and a payload capacity of up to 42 tons, first flying in March of '78. After that, the machine started taking on jobs nobody had ever expected of it. Based on the Il-76, they built an airborne early warning and control aircraft, with an enormous rotating radome mounted above the fuselage. They built a flying weightlessness laboratory for training cosmonauts. The aircraft flies a parabolic arc, and for 25 to 30 seconds inside the cargo bay, a state of freefall sets in. That's exactly how you train before a spaceflight. And an aerial firefighter appeared too. 2 cylindrical tanks, 21,000 litres each, are installed in the cargo bay. They're filled right on the airfield through fire hoses. 42 tons of water or fire retardant come down in a single pass from an altitude of several dozen meters. 42 tons is the weight of a railway tanker car, dumped onto the Tiger in one pass. In total, around 1,000 aircraft were built in Tashkent. In 2010, production was officially moved to Russia, to the plant in Ulyanovsk, where today they build a deeply modernized version with turbofan engines, the PS-90 A-76, producing up to 14,500 kilograms of thrust. Now for the dark side of the story, without which this account wouldn't be honest. On July 1st, 2016, an Il-76 TD belonging to the Ministry of Emergency Situations, carrying its own name, Nikolai Kamanin, was working to put out forest fires in Irkutsk Oblast. The aircraft had arrived in the region on June 17th, and by that day had already flown 33 sorties, dropping more than 1,000 tons of water. That day, after another drop, the aircraft failed to check in on schedule. They searched for nearly 2 days. The wreckage was found on the slope of a hill in the Kachug district. The entire crew was killed, 10 people. All of them were posthumously awarded the Order of Courage. The cause of the crash was never officially established. This is the part you don't see in the footage of water cascading out of the cargo bay. Firefighting from the air is low-altitude work, over burning taiga, in smoke where visibility drops to zero and the terrain becomes impossible to read. An aircraft designed half a century ago for airdrops over flat ground is doing a job it was never built for, and doing it right at the edge. On March 25, 1971, at Kodinka Field, they doubted whether the runway would be enough. The runway was enough. And for the next 55 years, this machine did exactly the same thing, again and again, proving, time after time, that it had enough runway in places where, by the numbers, it shouldn't have. Sometimes there was no runway at all. There was ice, there was dirt, there was taiga beneath the wing, and 42 tons of water in the hold. It came in anyway.